Welcome to Salesology, conversations with sales leaders, the art of faster, easier, more profitable sales. When you're ready to transform your sales for today's transforming market, we've got you covered with your host, the queen of cold calling and founder of Salesology, award-winning author, speaker, sales trainer, and coach, Wendy Weiss.
Hi, welcome to Salesology, conversations with sales leaders, the art of faster, easier, more profitable sales. And I am your host, Wendy Weiss. I am the founder of Salesology and creator of the Salesology prospecting method. I'm also known as the queen of cold calling. And today, our very special guest is Lisa Bloom. She is the founder of Story Coach, and she works with entrepreneurs and business owners to help them build confidence, attract ideal clients, and find their success story. Lisa is a professional storyteller. She's an accredited coach, author, mentor, and leadership expert. She is the author of the bestsellers, The Story Advantage, and I love the title of this one, Cinderella and the Coach. And she is also the creator of Selling Through Story and the Story Coach certification. So welcome, Lisa Bloom.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's begin at the beginning. What's the Lisa Bloom story? How did you become the story coach?
Yeah. So, it's funny. I always say to people, you don't have one story. Like we all have so many, many different stories. But we do have one story for each situation, I guess. So what I would say is I became the story coach because when I left my corporate career, because of just, life circumstances, didn't want to continue doing the whole corporate lifestyle, and decided somewhat reluctantly to go into coaching, I began to notice that on the other side of my life, where I was discovering storytelling as this thing that, in a sense, I'd always been doing, but hadn't really noticed, I began to notice that storytelling and coaching were so intimately related. And I could see these profound ways in which, as a coach, essentially you're asking people about their story. And as an entrepreneur, the people who had great stories about themselves, their offers, what they were doing, were the people who were more successful. And even in organizations, I could see that the leaders who were more successful were great storytellers. And so I began to really explore and begin to see the connections between storytelling and coaching, and thus Story Coach was born.
Okay. So I have to ask you, since you are a coach, why were you reluctant at first to go into coaching?
Yeah. So, I came out of a corporate career as a learning and development leader. And I was always very passionate about how adults learn and how people shift and change in life. And so when I came out of corporate, and I hadn't, I didn't grow up with this big ambition to be an entrepreneur. I just wanted to have a good job and a great career. But I came out of that career because my kids were small. I didn't want to have that lifestyle, the 80-hour-a-week lifestyle. And people said to me, oh, you should be a coach. And at that time, my first thought was, well, that seems like a bit of a fad. Everybody calls themselves a coach. And is it a real thing? Like, does it actually work? And I'd seen coaching in the organizations, and I'd even taught some coaching courses, but I wasn't sure that coaching as a profession was serious enough in my mind. Like, was that a real thing? And so I took a course, which is my way. I want to learn something. I'll go take the real course. I'll go look into it. And I found it to be this profound shift, like this ability to really look at where you are in life and make changes, whether it's around your business, whether it's in your personal life. I found coaching to be incredibly powerful and got very interested in coaching. But ultimately, I was also super interested in business. And so what I began to notice was that coaches, which is the world I was in at that time, and entrepreneurs, but particularly coaches, they may have been great at coaching, but they were terrible at selling their services and selling themselves. And they told a really awful story, if any story at all, about what they were doing. And so they weren't getting clients. And so I got really interested in, how do I help coaches? How do I enable coaches, and then later other entrepreneurs, to be more successful by being able to tell a story that actually attracted clients to them and that empowered them to be able to really kind of show up and be present in their business. And so that's how that kind of morphed from coaching into, oh, there's this whole business side. And my background was business, both in terms of my education and my experience. And so it made total sense that I would help people with building their business, and sales is like such a sticking point for people. That was where story I could see would be so effective.
Okay, so what exactly does storytelling mean in the context of selling?
Yeah, so basically the idea of using storytelling is that what I've come to see is true is that people are interested in information and they're interested in data and statistics and numbers and so on, but they are moved by story. And so if we want to sell something, the more information you give, it'll be interesting for people, but it won't really move them to take action. Whereas if you tell a story about, what you're selling, essentially, if you tell a story that is, and when I say a story, I mean a real experience with real people. It's not something that's made up in order to try and manipulate or convince someone, but an actual real story of your experience or the experience of a client, and you share that with a person, that will move them to a place where they'll take action and hire you or buy the thing you're selling much, much faster than any amount of information. And it's not to say that information isn't important, but it's not what moves people. And so I began to see that when I could tell a powerful story, and whether it's a story of my own experience or a story of the problem that people were trying to solve, or a story of the outcome that people had got from, buying whatever the thing is, people were much more likely to actually take action and actually take the next move. But even beyond that, what story does is it creates a connection between people and it builds trust. And we all know, at least on an intellectual level almost, we all know that we need trust in order to be able to sell successfully. And I believe that story is one of the fastest ways to build trust. It's almost instant.
I'm glad that you made that distinction about the story being authentic as opposed to something that's made up, because I think sometimes that many business owners or entrepreneurs, as we were discussing before I hit record, they think selling is icky. And if you've got a story that you have made up, then yes, that does make you probably kind of manipulative. But if you're telling your authentic story, then you're simply being authentic. And you correct me if I'm wrong, I'd venture to say it even makes you more vulnerable.
Well, vulnerability can be very effective as long as it's not for the sake of vulnerability, but it's actually genuine and authentic. And, sometimes, there's always a danger of being too vulnerable, which is ineffective, it doesn't work, and it also can do damage. So my goal is never vulnerability. My goal is authenticity, right? And so I think from the beginning of time, particularly salespeople actually would try and do this kind of acrobatics around, let me figure out what it is that people need to hear, and let's make up the story that's going to convince them and manipulate them to do that thing. And that's not at all what I'm talking about, and I believe it's not what you're talking about either. Instead, what we're talking about is connecting with people at the level of, this genuine, real, and authentic connection that says, hey, here's my experience, if it is of use to you, and I'm sharing this with you because I think I may be able to help you. And if it's not a good fit, no worries at all. But if it is a good fit, we're building a relationship here. We're building connection and we're building trust. And that can only happen through authentic story. And authenticity is something, it's quite hard to fake authenticity. Like you can't really fake it. You feel it. You kind of feel it in your body almost. You feel like if somebody's being authentic, you just know that what they're saying is true. And when people make up stuff, you get that sense too, that it doesn't quite feel right. And so when you're telling story, the effect is that you build the connection and, you show up for real, but it also is easier because you're just telling something that happened. You're not making stuff up, and you don't have to try and remember or manipulate or figure things out. It's just sharing something from that kind of heart space of, here's what I'm going to share with you in service of you, number one, and to see if there's a match with the thing I'm trying to sell, number two.
So how do you know what stories to tell, or how do you even come up with your stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. Initially, you have to understand your audience. You have to understand where they are and what they're at and what their challenge is and what's of interest to them, what's relevant to them, because the greatest story, the most enthralling story is useless if it's relevant. If it's irrelevant. So you have to find a story that's going to match the audience or the client that you're talking to. And then it's about really being, it's amazing the consciousness around story. I find when I teach story to people, that oftentimes within a few weeks of the program, they'll come to me and they'll say, wow, I'm seeing story everywhere. I never noticed it before. But we're all kind of talking in story. And so what happens is when you begin to do this intention, you begin to really pay attention to the experiences that you have day in, day out, that are the seeds of great story that you can share with others. And so what I teach people is I don't teach them to make up stuff. I teach them to notice these seeds, notice these pivotal moments, notice these things that happen in their life that are the potential for a wonderful story, and then how to craft the story in order to be able to connect with the audience. And again, it's always about matching the relevant story, the right story to the right audience at the right time.
Okay, Lisa, so tell us a story, please. Can you give us an example of a seed, a pivotal moment, something like, how do you identify that? How did you or a client identify that seed to create that story?
Yeah, sure. So I haven't prepared for this, of course, but there's always, can I actually backtrack a minute? But I will get to answer your question. But yes. I remember I had a marketing coach many, many years ago when I was starting my business. And she said to me, Lisa, if you want to connect and build an audience, at the time I was blogging, she said, you have to tell a story at least once a week. At the time I was doing it once a month. And I said to her, oh my goodness, once a week. I said to her, my life isn't that interesting. Where am I going to find stories? And she said, oh, I trust you. And from that day on, for 10 years solidly, I wrote a story every week, and I built up, a really nice audience as a result of that. And it's not that my life got any more interesting. It was just that I started noticing these moments. And so a pivotal moment, which is essentially the seed of a great story, is when something happens that in some way moves you, in some way, just you feel something, and it has the potential to be told in a way that might impact your audience, depending on who your audience is. So, for example, I'll give you an example of something recent, and it's something that, it's a small thing, but it's also a big thing. So I wrote an article to send out to my list as a nurture piece. Okay. Because remember, story can be used for lots of different things. Ultimately, it brings to sale. But I wrote an article about how, I had blogged for 10 years religiously, never missed a week except for 1 week. And that 1 week was the week that my dog died many, many years ago. And I was so brokenhearted that I just couldn't do a thing. And I wrote about how, this connection that you feel between yourself and a beloved animal is something that I never expected. She was my first dog and, completely devastated. And then I wrote about how we had just actually adopted a new dog. And this is a few dogs later, but we had just that week adopted a new dog. And I talked about this connection that you build, and how the connection that you build with an animal, in a sense, is a connection that you can build with anyone. And, I just talked about like the difference between human connection and trust, and what's the difference between, building a connection with somebody based on trust versus not, and this whole thing expanded into this really nice story. The pivotal moment there was, I guess, the realization. I mean, there were a few pivotal moments in what I've described, but the one pivotal moment was, coming back to the puppy and seeing this look in her eyes that reminded me of that connection I had with the dog that had passed away. And it reminded me with that connection I feel with people. These are the pivotal moments that you build out into something bigger. So that's kind of the basis of where you find stories. But in terms of sales, like, I've had many situations where, okay, I'll give you a pivotal moment for a sale, something that just came to mind. I was working with a corporate client or I was hoping to work with a corporate client, and I'd sent them a proposal for some storytelling work in their organization. And I was called in to meet with the CEO. And I remember I was called into this meeting, and he had seen the proposal, and I arrived up there and I looked at the proposal, and I started to take him through it. And at the end of it, I'll never forget it, he pushed back from his desk, he crossed his arms, and he said to me, "This could be fantastic, and it could be absolute rubbish, and I don't know which one it is." And I was like, oh, like I didn't even know what to say. And the woman who was the HR manager who had brought me in and we'd worked before, she's like, "Well, I know it's going to be brilliant." And he's like, "Yeah, well, let me think about it." And I realized I'd completely blown it. It was a disaster. And I walked out and I thought about, oh my goodness, now what do I do? And I said to the HR manager, "Is there any way I could meet with him again?" And she said, "Let me work on it, maybe next week." And the following week I came and I said to him, "I'd love to understand what's going on in your organization. Tell me about your team. Tell me what's happening for them." And he began to tell me, and I said, "Oh, okay. And what would you love to see? What would you really love to see in your organization? Tell me, like, if you could wave a magic wand, what would that look like for you? Tell me the story of 5 years from now when everything is running smoothly." And he started to tell me, and I started to extract from him this beautiful story of what he was trying to build. And as he was telling me the story, I said, "Oh, that's interesting. That reminds me of the work I did with such and such an organization and I told a little story about that." And then he said something else. I said, "Oh, interesting. Because when I worked with such and such an organization, I told him another little story about how this hadn't worked and how, we chose that path instead." Anyway, by the end of this little back and forth around his story of what he wanted and my stories of my experience, he said to me, "Okay, we're doing it." That was it. Didn't ask price, didn't ask anything else. He said, "You know what? We're doing it. And you know what else? I want you to talk to the whole organization, not just my senior team." And when I went in with one proposal, I came out with 3. And it was all because of the ability to listen to his story, tell my story, match all the stories together, and walk away from this kind of, again, informational transactional approach to selling, and instead saying, let's just hear the stories that we need to, let's share the stories we need to tell in order to find the match, in order to find where it integrates and where it makes sense.
I love that story, Lisa.
Thank you.
And I actually have a couple more questions for you about that story.
Awesome.
We're going to pause now for a word from our sponsor, but when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation about your storytelling that got you a bigger sale. So now a word from our sponsor, the Salesology Vault. Just about every guest that I've interviewed on the Salesology Conversations with Sales Leaders podcast has had a free gift for our listeners. And that does include my special guest today, Lisa Bloom. She has a gift for you as well. And so what we've done is we've taken all of those gifts and we put them all in one place just for you. We call it the Salesology Vault, and it is packed full of free gifts from sales leaders, sales experts, marketing gurus, revenue generation gurus, and we add another gift every single week. We release a podcast every Monday, and then we add a gift. So you can log in as often as you'd like and download as many gifts as you'd like. It's all free. Go to bit.ly/gift vault, or the link to the Salesology Vault is in the show notes. Go to the notes, click on the link, download your gifts. You'll be glad you did. And we are back with my special guest, Lisa Bloom, the story coach, who just told us a fabulous story about how she used stories to close an even bigger deal. So I think, Lisa, what I heard you say was the first part of what you did was finding out the information from your potential client that enabled you to match the story to what was going on with that potential client. So it's not a matter of just like showing up and telling a story. It's about getting the right information that enables you to tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, in the situation where you're having a conversation with someone, and you're actually having a sales conversation, my recommendation is always to let the other person speak first so that you can match the story. And I have many experiences of doing that. I had one CEO say to me, so what do you do and how much does it cost? And I said to him, well, before we go there, can you tell me a little bit about like why you asked me here and what's going on for you and a little bit of your background? And so he then went into this whole thing about himself and the organization, what he wanted and what he was looking for. And then I said, okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about me. And then I could tell him the exact experiences, the exact stories that matched what he had just said. And by the end of it, he said, let's do it. We're starting. He didn't even ask me the price at that point. Like that's the experience I've had again and again and again, is that all of the points of resistance that you might expect just dissolve when the stories match. That's happened so often. But yes, so listening to them and then being able to come up with the experiences that are relevant. But, when you're not talking about a sales conversation, when you're talking about, for example, marketing collateral, we're talking about stuff that maybe you're writing about or stuff that you're speaking about, whether it's a speaking engagement or whether it's a blog or whether it's social media stuff, the letting them speak first should be your knowledge of your target audience, right? That's how it equates. So if you're just throwing out sales type of stuff too broadly, that's not going to be relevant because you haven't actually identified your target audience or understand what's on their minds, then it's not going to work. So that's kind of the starting point, is understand who your target market is, understand what their concerns are, really get to know them well. Then when you begin to use story, it's going to be relevant.
Yes. And I like when you told your story about the first CEO that leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms.
Yeah.
You asked him to tell you a story.
Yeah.
What do you see? Tell me the story of what it looks like 5 years from now. So you are not only telling stories, you're getting your prospects, your potential clients to tell you their stories.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, I've always said storytelling is only enabled by story listening. You can't tell stories unless you're willing to listen to stories. They're hand in hand. And secondly, I personally use that vocabulary a lot, this idea of story, because people like stories, so they like to feel like they're telling a story, but also it helps people understand that stories are very malleable and they're not always true. Meaning, my sister and I, we often joke about how we talk about something that happened in our childhood. And I've often turned around to her and say, did we grow up in the same house? Like our stories are so vastly different. And so even though you might have experienced the same thing, you're going to tell a slightly different story. And it's not that one is a truth and one is a lie. It's that we have different perspectives. So when I say to somebody, tell me the story of where you're at right now, or tell me the story of what's going to be in 5 years' time, it allows me to kind of introduce this concept that it's a story and stories can be changed. And if we work together, actually, we're going to craft a new story. And that's going to be so much more empowering and so much more aligned with what you need.
So speaking of empowering, I have to ask you your definition of a success story, because when I introduced you and I read your bio, you're the founder of Story Coach. You work with entrepreneurs and business owners to help them build confidence, attract ideal clients, and find their success story. So what's a success story?
Well, I think a success story is a story that meets your goals in that moment. So, part of being able to tell stories well is being able to understand, like, what is your actual intention in telling this story? So I think that, for example, the blog that I wrote for over 10 years was full of success stories because it kept me a very strong readership and it grew my list. So that was successful. For somebody, if I'm coaching a CEO and they need to be able to command an audience and be able to kind of feel comfortable on a stage, then for them, the success story is in that moment to be able to actually be fully present and to get the best outcome from the speaking event. So it's in a way, it's a kind of a blanket statement because it just depends on what the person needs it for. Generally speaking, I'm working with entrepreneurs or leaders who have very specific needs. With entrepreneurs, it's often about being able to build on their credibility, being able to attract clients, being able to sell their services to their ideal clients. And with leaders, it's also selling, but it's maybe selling people into ideas, to enroll people to support the ideas that they have. So in a sense, a success story is one that converts the audience to the concept, to the idea, and hopefully into the offer.
So is a success story outbound in that the individual is telling the story, or is a success story what the individual is telling herself or himself, or is it both?
Yeah, I love that you picked up on that because that's a whole different layer of the work that I do that's really powerful, because I do believe that there is an outer story and an inner story. And I think that you can have the most fabulous outer story, but unless the inner story is aligned with it, then it doesn't come across as authentic. And so when I do a lot of the story coach work that I do, either with individuals, with groups, or through my story coach, like part of being a story coach is to be able to help people really uncover the inner story that might be sabotaging their outer story. They may have an experience that they want to share, but unless they're actually aligned with that experience in their inner story, then it's going to be problematic. I mean, an example of this would be, for many, many years, as a storyteller, as a performing storyteller, I was really fairly crippled with stage fright. I mean, I really had bad stage fright, even though I was a performer, I was on stages internationally and the whole thing, really had bad stage fright. And I couldn't figure out why I was so scared and why I was really struggling, other than, as a child, I'd had some stuff, I had occasions, as a child, speaking and forgetting my lines and feeling ridiculed and all that kind of stuff. But there was also something about me being a storyteller that initially in the first years felt almost like I had this thought that, like, I'm a fake. And I couldn't understand why I had this belief that I was a fake. And then one day I sat and I thought, okay, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to try and think where this is coming from. And I remembered that as a young child, I have an older sister. I have two older sisters, but one of my older sisters, I always remember there was this one Friday evening. We were all together with the family having a big dinner, and there were some guests, some visitors. And one person turned around to my sister and said to her, "So what are you going to be when you grow up?" And she said, without a hesitation, she said, "I'm going to be an actor." And I remember thinking, oh no, I want to act, but there's only ever one actor in a family. And so from that moment on, I realized anything to do with the stage, it shouldn't be, I couldn't do that. There was just something in that, whatever that perception was when I was 6 years old, 7 years old, that believed I couldn't be on a stage. And so when I finally got to go on stages, I still had this inner story that said I was a fake. And the ridiculous thing, of course, was that my sister never ended up doing anything to do with acting. And she went into corporate America and she got all kinds of, she's been extremely successful, but doesn't like speaking at all and does no acting. Whereas I was following that my whole life. And so I realized in that moment, oh, this is a really old inner story that's completely ridiculous, completely irrelevant. And when I realized that, it was almost laughable. I could release it. I could let it go. And then I stopped feeling like a fake. And then I started finding ways to actually deal with the stage fright that meant that I actually, I had no problem anymore. So while I still maybe get nervous, I now have ways to get beyond it and tell, I know that I actually love telling stories. I know I love being on stages and that I'm good at it and that it's fine. And so I work through all that. So it was the inner story that was holding me back. But that's like a level that, for sales, I think is super relevant, because if you have an inner story that says, if I try and sell something, then A, people aren't going to want it, or B, I'm not good enough, or C, I sound sleazy, then that is the inner story that it has to be moved on in order to be able to tell the outer story. But when you tell a story as opposed to trying to pitch, it's actually much easier because it feels more natural and more authentic.
I love that. So I know you have a gift for our listeners. So please share the story of your gift. What do you have for us today?
So I have an ebook. It's called 7 Stories That Sell. And basically what it does is it outlines the critical stories that you need to master. And it's a lovely way to kind of go through what are the stories, and I have little models of how to put them together, and it's very workable. So very accessible. So I'm really happy to share that with you.
Okay, wonderful. So as soon as you finish listening to this podcast, the link for Lisa's ebook is in the show notes. So go to the show notes, click on the link, download the ebook. You will be glad that you did. And Lisa, where can people want to be in touch with you? Where can they find you?
Pretty much everywhere that you look, Story Coach Lisa Bloom, you're going to find me. So whether it's on social media, whether it's on my website, story-coach.com, or of course through the ebook, you'll be able to contact me there. But I'm pretty much everywhere, and I look forward to any questions or any thoughts or any ideas about what we've discussed.
Okay, so if you want to get in touch with Lisa Bloom, who is apparently everywhere, we will also have the links to her website and her social media. We will have that all in the show notes. So the easy way, go to the show notes, click on the links. And you have been listening to Salesology, Conversations with Sales Leaders, the art of faster, easier, more profitable sales, with my special guest, Lisa Bloom, founder of Story Coach. And if you have found value in listening to today's podcast, then please think about one business owner, one entrepreneur, one sales leader that you think might also find value in listening to this podcast, and please do share the link with them. And until we meet again, visualize yourself surrounded by cash, really large bills.
You've been listening to Salesology, Conversations with Sales Leaders, the art of faster, easier, more profitable sales. Be sure to follow so that you don't miss a single episode. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share it with your friends. Tune in every week for more exciting insights and wisdom on transforming sales. And until next time, visualize yourself surrounded by cash, very large bills.